The fence had been broken for years. The old wooden slats, once clean and straight, now leaned in odd angles, like tired shoulders worn by time and weather. One post had split entirely, held together only by a knot of rusted wire and hope. It stood at the edge of Thomas's property, just before the land dipped into the woods, where the wild things still moved without needing permission. Thomas hadn't fixed it, not because he didn't know how. He'd built it himself back in '92, but because some part of him had stopped fixing things when his son died. Some damage, he figured, wasn't meant to be repaired. He lived alone now in the same small farmhouse they'd shared, the same creaky rooms, the same cracked kitchen tiles. He got up early, fed the chickens, drank his coffee without sugar, and watched the fence from the kitchen window. Every morning, every evening, like it might change, like it might mean something if it did. The truth was, he didn't expect anything anymore. Not from the world, not from the land, not even from himself. But one morning in late October, something appeared beside the fence. He thought at first it was a shadow, but it moved, slow and quiet. A stag, tall, proud, beautiful in a way only wild creatures can be. Its coat was thick and deep brown, brushed with the gold of morning light. One leg dragged slightly, and there, tangled in the broken wires, a fresh wound. The stag looked at Thomas, and Thomas, without meaning to, breathed out a name he hadn't said in years. Ben! Not because he thought it was his son, but because something in the stag's eyes looked exactly like his boy did that last day. Tired, hurt, and full of things he couldn't say. Thomas didn't move. He stood at the kitchen window with his calloused hands gripping a chipped mug, steam rising slowly, as if afraid to disturb what had settled in front of him. The stag didn't run. It limped a few feet, stepped over the lowest part of the fence, and wandered into the open pasture like it had done it 100 times before. It stopped not far from the barn, close enough for Thomas to see the wound more clearly. It wasn't deep, but it looked raw, fresh, probably caught on a wire. A wild thing meeting something man-made and unforgiving. Thomas set his mug down, grabbed the coat that still smelled faintly of hay and smoke, and stepped outside. The air was cool, still holding the weight of night. Leaves crunched underfoot. Stag turned its head, but didn't move. It watched, measured, as if trying to remember something it had never known. He kept a slow pace. No sudden steps. No calls, just presence. 20 feet away, he stopped. That fence, he said softly, like talking to the morning itself. It's broken. The stag didn't respond. Of course it didn't, but it didn't leave either. Thomas knelt down, pulled a few apples from the bucket near the barn, and rolled one across the grass. The red skin caught the sun just right. The stag blinked, stepped forward, sniffed, and, after a long pause, ate, and it turned, walked back through the broken slats, disappeared into the trees. Thomas stood there a long time after it left. He didn't know why, only that something had shifted in him, and in the world. Here's the continuation of your 7,000-word cinematic script. The next morning, Thomas didn't expect to see it again. Wild things weren't known for trusting. They moved through the world in silence, teaching themselves to stay hidden, to stay wary, to stay alive. But when he stepped out with his coffee, black, same mug, same porch, the stag was there. Not at the fence this time, closer, near the edge of the barn, standing in the long grass that hadn't been trimmed since late summer. The wound on its leg looked stiff, but dry. Its body, still and tall, carried an air of both majesty and exhaustion. Thomas watched from the steps. He didn't speak, didn't want to break whatever strange thread had pulled this creature back to him. He sat down, leaned against the wooden railing, and just watched. After a few minutes, the stag stepped forward, slow and cautious, and began nibbling at the grass. Not hurried, not desperate, comfortable. Thomas smiled, though it surprised even him. He hadn't smiled at anything in months, not since the silence in the house grew thicker than the air outside, not since his neighbors stopped asking how he was doing, because the answer never changed. He stayed there for almost an hour, watching, and when the stag finally turned and made its way back through the broken fence, Thomas stood. Not slowly, not stiffly. He just stood, and something inside him stood with him. That night, he dreamed for the first time in what felt like years. Not of his son's accident, not of the empty hospital bed or the beeping machines. He dreamed of a stag, strong, slow, silent, standing beside a man who had nearly forgotten how to be alive. Over the next week, the stag kept returning, not every day, but often enough that Thomas began to expect it. He stopped trimming the grass where it liked to eat, left a bucket of water near the barn, dropped a few apples in the usual spot, like it was routine. And always, the stag came alone. It didn't come close, never let Thomas touch it, but it came. And that was enough. People in town would have said he was crazy, that wild animals don't visit, that this wasn't a story worth believing. But Thomas didn't care. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He had lived enough years to know that not everything needed explaining. Some things just were. The wound began to heal slowly. The limp faded. The stag's movements became smoother, more confident. But even when it could leap easily over the broken slats, it still chose the same path, through the bent space between the two leaning posts. Thomas thought about fixing it, bought the wood, laid it by the porch, but he didn't lift the hammer, because for the first time in years, something was coming through. Not just a deer, something else. Something that belonged just as much as it didn't, and he didn't want to shut that out. One morning, just before sunrise, Thomas stepped outside to find something new. Tracks. Not the stag's, footprints, fresher than he liked. He followed them to the edge of the fence. Then along the far field, they disappeared near the trees, but the unease stayed. Poachers had come through these woods before, once every year or so, especially after the rut. Always quiet, always gone before sunrise, but they left marks, cut wire, broken branches, beer cans in the grass. Thomas didn't like the idea that someone else knew about the stag, that someone might see it not as a visitor, but as a prize. He loaded his old rifle that night, not to shoot, just to be sure. He hadn't touched the thing in years, not since teaching Ben how to line up a shot, not long before the accident. He sat on the porch under the moonlight, the stars muted by fog, and when the stag appeared from the shadows, walking its quiet, limping path through the same broken gap, Thomas felt his heart lift and sink at once. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he whispered. The stag paused, ears twitching toward the sound. Thomas stayed seated, let the moment settle. He didn't want to be a protector. He wasn't trying to be a hero, but this creature had come into his silence like a memory that refused to fade, and he wasn't going to lose it too. Here's the continuation of your cinematic script: the stag and the broken fence. The shot rang out before the sun was fully up. Thomas jolted awake, sound cutting clean through the fog and the wall of morning silence. He stumbled to the door, boots half-laced, heart pounding. Another shot, closer this time, not the kind meant to scare. The rifle was in his hands before he knew what he was doing. He ran toward the woods, toward the fence, and then he saw it. One of the new fence posts, split in two, not by weather, not by time, by force. Cracks in the mud, heavy boots. A discarded shell casing, but no blood. Thomas's chest tightened. He stepped through the broken space, into the trees. His breath came in clouds. His fingers trembled. And then, movement. Ahead, through the trees, a figure running. He didn't give chase, just raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The figure turned, stumbled, and vanished into the trees. Silence returned, but not peace. He turned back toward the clearing. That's when he saw the stag, standing perfectly still among the trees, just beyond the shattered post, its eyes wide, nostrils flared. No wound this time, just fear. Thomas lowered the rifle. "It's okay," he said gently. Stag didn't move. "You're all right. I'm here." The words sounded strange coming from his mouth, like they belonged to someone who hadn't spoken in years. Maybe they did. The stag blinked slowly, took one step forward, then another. Then, as quietly as it had come, it disappeared into the trees. Thomas stood there a long time, not holding the gun anymore, just holding his breath. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep, not because of fear, not because of the poacher, but because of what he had said. "I'm here." It wasn't just for the stag. He knew that now. It was for Ben, for himself, for all the things he'd let rot in silence. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the old toolbox, the one with his son's name still scratched on the side. Then he stood, pulled on his boots, walked outside with a lantern, and for the first time in 7 years, he began fixing the fence. Not just a patch, not just a quick repair. He replaced the whole section, cut the wood clean, hammered every nail with steady hands, straightened the wire, replanted the post. It took hours. When the sun rose, the fence stood straight and strong, except for one spot. He left a gap wide enough for a stag to pass through without catching its legs. Just wide enough, because not everything broken needs to be shut out. Some things need space to return. Continuing your script The Stag and the Broken Fence. Here comes the final stretch. 3 days passed, and the stag didn't come back. Thomas tried not to worry, told himself it was normal. Wild things moved. They wandered, disappeared, came back when they needed. But deep down, something felt off. Each morning he stood at the kitchen window, eyes fixed on the fence line, hoping to see the familiar figure move out of the trees. But nothing came. He walked the woods, slowly, carefully, following old prints, broken leaves, patches of grass bent just slightly. Nothing fresh, nothing certain, and still no stag. The apples near the barn began to rot. The bucket of water sat untouched. He tried to keep busy, fixing the shed door, mending a torn glove. The silence pressed in harder than it had in months. Not the old silence of grief, but a newer kind, like something sacred had slipped through his fingers. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the wind play with the grass, he whispered something he hadn't said in years. "Please, come back." And for a moment, it wasn't the stag he was talking to. It was his son. It was just before the first frost when it happened. Thomas was chopping wood at the back of the house when he heard the sound. Soft, slow steps in dry leaves. Not urgent, not afraid, familiar. He dropped the axe and turned. The stag stood near the edge of the trees, still tall, still proud. But something was different. Smaller shape stood beside it. Younger deer, maybe 6 months old. Slender legs, wide eyes, ears flicking in the breeze. A fawn. Thomas blinked. Breath caught in his chest. He didn't move. The stag stepped forward, slow and certain. Fawn followed, hesitating at the tree line, then bounding across the fence gap with youthful clumsiness. They stood in the pasture for a long time. The older stag still limped slightly, but now it wasn't alone. Thomas knelt slowly, reaching into the bucket by the barn for an apple. He placed it gently on the grass and stepped back. The fawn watched him, curious but unsure. Then, after a few seconds, it took a step forward, another, until its nose touched the apple, and it began to eat. The stag didn't interfere, just stood back and watched. So did Thomas, and something inside him softened in a way he hadn't expected. Something uncurled, not healed, not fully, but breathing again. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. The fence didn't stop them, and neither did he. Winter came early that year. The sky turned silver. The trees held snow like secrets. The land slowed down, as it always did. Thomas didn't feel quite so still. He still lived alone, still drank coffee at dawn, still fed the chickens. But now, each day felt like a page he wanted to turn, not just a day he had to survive. The stag and the fawn came less often as the snow deepened, but he always left apples, always checked the fence, always kept the gap open. Some days, there were no tracks. Some days, there were two. He kept building after that. Small things. New gate for the barn, a bench near the porch, a bird feeder. Then, one afternoon, he started a new project. A small wooden sign. It took him weeks. When he finished, he nailed it to the post just beside the gap in the fence. It said, "Come and go safe." And below that, in smaller letters, "For those who leave and those who return." He stood back, looked at it, and smiled. Not because it fixed anything, but because it meant he was still trying, still here. And somehow, that was enough. This is for anyone who's lost, waited, or learned how to live again. Like, comment, and share if it touched you.